Hello, psychology students. This is Mr. Everton, and this is our third and final video in our module on psychological disorders. So the first video, we talked about what is a disorder. And the second video, we talked about two major categories of disorder, schizophrenia and mood disorders, which include things like depression and bipolar disorder. Coffee in the afternoon. It's a good thing. Sorry. And today, because we have limited time, I've just sort of crammed a couple, 2 or 3 different lessons together into one lecture, which I'm calling Disorders Roundup. Yeehaw. Yeah. So today I'm going to describe for you the symptoms of a number of different disorders. You can see them listed here on the screen, but we're going to go into some more depth and detail. And then once you're done with this, you should take a quiz, which will include questions on all of the disorders from 11.2 and 11.3. It's not really a quiz. Remember, it's a classwork grade. And then there's a hyperdoc, which is just like, you'll see, you make a copy of it on Canvas, and then you use the activities, the media, the articles and videos and what have you in the left-hand column to answer the questions in the right-hand column. So let's get started. An anxiety disorder. That's another category of disorders we're going to talk about. We've got 3 different ones that we're going to talk about. Anxiety disorders are all about, as one would expect, anxiety. Pretty sure everybody knows something about anxiety right now. Yeah? Am I right? Sure. Anxiety obviously has to do with fear. Hence this classic painting, Edvard Munch's The Scream. An anxiety disorder is any disorder where fear gets out of hand and worry and nervousness get in the way of a person's ability to function. And it also can involve the behaviors that we use in order to cope with those feelings of fear and worry and nervousness. So this can include phobias, panic attacks, obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD, and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So I was going through the slideshow before I did this lecture, and I saw the hand washing shot, and I was just like, it just hits different, But obsessive compulsive disorder, like the number one thing that is kind of known for is like people obsessively washing their hands, right? Which maybe now it wouldn't even be considered a disorder anymore. I'm kidding. But like, we're talking about even obsessive, like beyond the hand washing that's going on right now in this moment of COVID, like people who are washing their hands like 5 times in a row with scalding hot water, using a different bar of soap each time and then throwing it away and then getting out a new bar of soap and then washing their hands again. That's what I'm talking about. So like over the top hand washing. There are other kinds of behaviors that are potentially part of obsessive compulsive disorder. Okay, so to explain. The reason why, if somebody who has obsessive compulsive disorder is washing their hands like that, and not every person with OCD washes their hands in that way. But if they are, right, if that's the way that it manifests, you see this person obsessively washing their hands, the reason why is because that person has unwanted repetitive thoughts about germs. They're freaking out about germs getting into their body and making them sick. And, like there's these microscopic organisms and they're on me and I can't see them, but I know they're there and they're going to get me. They're obsessed with it. And they can't just stop thinking about it, right? It's an intrusive thought pattern that is invading their brain and stopping them from being able to think about other things they would want to think about, right? Like maybe they want to think about class. Maybe they want to think about their job at Wegmans, but they can't because they're so obsessed with the idea that germs are going to get them or that they left the stove on, right? That's another common obsession. Like somebody might become obsessed with the idea of like, oh God, I left the stove on last night. I know that I did. And so then that leads to a compulsion, which is an action to relieve stress that is caused by those obsessions, right? So the person who's obsessed with the idea that they left the stove on is then getting up and going and checking the stove like over and over and over again. Like they may go over and turn the stove off and then go sit back down and then get back up and check it again. A lot of times people with OCD will start to have these ideas that like certain numbers are sort of like, it's sort of like that certain numbers are like talismans, or they're like gonna like protect them against the bad thing. Think about really superstitious like basketball players who have to do a certain thing every time before they take a free throw. It's like that, but crazy. Excuse me, crazy is a problematic word. It's like that, but super intense. That's what I meant to say. So obsession, can't get this thought out of my head. Compulsion, I'm going to do this thing, which is really intense and over the top, in order to try to deal with the stress that is caused by my unwanted thought patterns. So some potential, like some common obsessions for people, OCD looks different for different people. Some common obsessions that people with OCD experience. The number one is concern with dirt and germs and toxins. Another is fear of like something horrible happening, like a fire or a car accident or somebody getting deathly ill. And then there's also people who are very focused on order and symmetry and trying to make things really tidy. So then the compulsions that come up because the repetitive behaviors people use to try to make themselves feel better can be like excessive grooming, like I said, hand washing, bathing, brushing their teeth. Repeating certain rituals, like going in and out of the door a number of times, standing up and down from a chair a number of times, and you get up and get out. And then like checking doors, checking light switches, checking locks and car brakes and homework, like and checking those things a number of different times. Okay, so that's OCD. Phobias. And by the way, I'm going so quick that all of these things obviously are way more complex than what I'm going into here. This is just a general overview and a taste of what these things involve so that you have some understanding of them. I'm not trying to make you an expert on OCD. So that was pretty short. Anyway, phobias. Phobias are fears that are overreacting to a specific source of fear. Like the anxiety that is created by the thing is disproportionate to the actual danger. Like I used an example in the previous video or two ago about somebody who's so afraid of going across a bridge that they won't do it, and that they have to find another route to drive their car that potentially takes them half an hour to an hour longer in order to avoid the bridge. There's actually, and this is such a thing, that in the Hampton Roads area where the Hampton Roads Bay Bridge Tunnel is, there are services that are available to like drive people across the Bay Bridge Tunnel. At least there were. Now it's called Uber, but back before things like Uber, like you could get somebody, you would like put your, I guess you would just put your headphones in and your face mask on in the back seat and just like ball up in a little fetal position, and like somebody else would handle the driving because you're so terrified of being able to drive across the bridge. That's called avoidance. So the thing with phobias is it's like you're terrified of this specific thing out of all proportion to what could actually probably happen to you. And so you start avoiding that thing. And this is just a list. I'm not going to go over every single one of these. Some of these are a lot more common than others, right? So like fear of heights, pretty common. Fear of bridges, fear of snakes and spiders, that's so common. But then fear of hair, fear of flowers, fear of open spaces is a huge one. Agoraphobia is a very common one that can really mess with people. Claustrophobia, fear of closed-in spaces. So final anxiety disorder before we move into two other categories. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a form of anxiety disorder. Trauma, in this instance, trauma is a deeply disturbing experience. Trauma is something terrible that happened to you that you have to deal with mentally and emotionally. And you have a memory of this thing that happened to you that is so overwhelming that you're unable to cope. Now, we all have different kinds of trauma, mental trauma that happened to us in our lives. Like if your parents got divorced, that's traumatic. If somebody important in your life dies, that's a trauma, right? PTSD is when the trauma is so intense that the person can't overcome it. They can't deal with the trauma that they experienced. Here you can see a graphic, the top 4 reasons that men and women suffer PTSD, and for both of them, it's rape. I'm sorry, like that's, trigger warning, I should have said, but like I think that's remarkable. We always think of PTSD as being something that is primarily experienced by servicemen and servicewomen in the armed forces. And it is. I mean, that's definitely a thing. But like the number one reason is sexual assault and rape. Symptoms of PTSD are night terrors, which is when you have horrible, like screaming and elevated heart rate and elevated breathing rate in your stage 4 of your sleep cycle. Um, Flashbacks, where you're like reliving the traumatic event that happened to you. Panic attacks, where you feel like you're having a heart attack, like you're unable to breathe, like you're going to pass out. And then there's even physiological disorders, which means physical things that happen to you. Like, after World War I, they called this shell shock. But people whose bodies stop working the way that they're supposed to because of psychological trauma, like people who aren't able to walk properly, who don't have full use of their limbs, or, can't speak because of psychological things. Nothing physically wrong with them, but because of the trauma they experienced, they are not able to, their body doesn't work the way that it used to. An estimated 8% of Americans, that's 24.4 million people, have PTSD at any one time. Women are twice as likely to experience PTSD as men. I think that is a startling statistic, and I think it gives you a sense of the kinds of inequality in our society that that women are experiencing trauma at such a higher rate than men. And I don't have a statistic for it here, but I would be willing to bet that people of color experience way more PTSD than white people do. Just saying. I that's a suspicion on my part, but I bet I'm right about that. Okay. So we're going to shift gears now. We're going to talk about something called somatoform disorders. And that's related to PTSD, frankly, because I just talked about shell shock, right? Well, somatoform disorders are when you have physical symptoms that have psychological causes. Your body is doing something, but there's nothing physically wrong with your body. The problem is in your brain. So it's really hard to diagnose somatoform disorders. They're not that common. And in order to diagnose them, which means figure out that you have one, you have to eliminate the alternatives, right? So like if you can't talk, like if you lost your voice, you go to the doctor, they're going to examine all the different physical structures in your body that help you to speak. And they're going to eliminate all the problems that might come up with those before they're going to finally say, oh, this is psychological. I had a panic attack when I was in my late 20s. I was freaking out about a variety of things in my personal life, financial aid for school and stuff like that. And I had a panic attack and I thought that I was dying of a heart attack. And, I went to the doctor and they hooked me up to an EKG machine and they asked me a bunch of questions about my diet and my exercise. And they asked me all these, they had to eliminate everything else. And then at the end of that, they went, you're having a panic attack. Like, we don't know that you're having a panic attack, but it's the only thing that makes sense now. We've eliminated all the other options. Okay, so one interesting kind of somatoform disorder that I want to tell you about is called conversion disorder, which is when emotional difficulties result in the loss of physical functions. I'm talking about loss of physical functions like paralysis, like your legs stop working. Blindness, you are no longer able to see things. You cannot swallow things. You cannot talk. I think that's like amazing that the body can manifest, psychological problems in this way. And a lot of times this is brought on by trauma as well. This is not unlike PTSD in that way. Another version of somatoform disorder is, let me get it to come up, Munchausen syndrome. Munchausen syndrome is also called facetious disorder, which is also really hard to diagnose. It's when a patient really wants the attention of a doctor. They want the attention that comes with the doctor examining them and checking over them and trying to take care of them and make sure that they're healthy. And so they do things to try to make themselves appear like they're ill. Like they swallow toxic chemicals that will land them in the hospital. Or they injure themselves in specific strategic ways that will end them up in the hospital and are designed to make it look like they have something else going on with them. There's an even more sinister version of this called Munchausen's by proxy, which is where a parent likes to be the parent of a kid who is ill. And so they simulate symptoms and harm a child in order to make the kid look like they're sick. And that's what this picture is of. This mom in this photo experienced Munchausen's by proxy and visited all kinds of horrible abuse and harm on her kid in order to make her kid appear to be, sick. And that child was in and out of hospitals for many, many years before her mother was no longer able to do that to her. So finally, talked about a bunch of different stuff. We're going to talk about dissociative disorders. And a dissociative disorder is something that changes your identity, something that changes your sense of self and who you are as a person, changes your consciousness. And I'm just going to talk about one, and it's the most famous one, and it's one that you've probably heard of before. It's called dissociative identity disorder. It used to be called multiple personality disorder. So this is when a person has different people, different personalities in their head. They exhibit more than one distinct and alternating personality. And alternating means they don't happen at the same time. So like a person will switch back and forth between at least two different personalities. Usually there's some sort of physical motion as they switch from one to the next. Some people, in rare cases, this is a pretty rare disorder, but there are recorded cases of people having like 14, 20 different discrete personalities. There's also been some pretty high profile examples of people saying that they had dissociative identity disorder, and then it turned out to be a hoax. So this has been controversial. There are people who think dissociative identity disorder is not a real thing. The people who do say that it is a thing say that it's caused by trauma. That what happens is the person suffering from dissociative identity disorder had something so horrible happen to them, usually in childhood, frequently sexual abuse, that they can't deal with thinking about their past. And so they like create an alternative person who doesn't have that history and doesn't have that trauma. And so they like move into this other personality as a way to try to cope with this this thing that they can't cope with. All right, so that is it for this lecture. I hope it wasn't too long. Please make sure that you complete the quiz on Canvas and that you complete the HyperDoc, which are basically a bunch of small extension activities for these different disorders to try to help you keep them straight. Thanks very much for watching, and I will talk to you again soon.